Welcome, my name's Dominic Wilsden. I'm the director of this Institute for Contemporary Art at VCU, and it's really a tremendous pleasure to be able to welcome you all here for this event today. We hosted equivalent events here this time of year before the pandemic, and so this is another one of those occasions where it's moving to be able to bring people back together again in this way. Here at the ICA, we're proud to be a host for these conversations, just as we are proud to work with VCU's inclusion agenda, community engagement agenda around so many things. You can always keep up to date with the things we have going on here by joining our free membership program. I'm not going to tell you what we have coming up. I'm going to mention one thing, though, one project that's in the works that seems pertinent to today and tomorrow and the days this week. We're about to announce a major exhibition inspired by the work of Elsie L, architect from Petersburg, Virginia, a black queer architect, only now getting her due. She worked in the mid-20th century. And in the 70s and 80s, she was dean of the School of the Arts at Virginia State University and pioneered new forms of black art education, including for some of the GIs who were returning from Vietnam at that time. That's a project we have in the works, and I mention it because there may be individuals here in the room who might be collaborators for us on that program and the community engagement we want to do around that. So do please get in touch if your interests lie in that direction. I'm going to hand over now to Sheila Hernandez-Rubio for some opening remarks for today's event. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sheila Hernandez-Rubio, and I am a student at Virginia Commonwealth University majoring in sociology. Today, I want to take a moment to say thank you to everyone for attending our Martin Luther King Jr. Keynote event for 2023. VCU hosts this annual event to honor both the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Our theme this year is Thriving Communities Partnering for Economic Justice is derived from Dr. King's 1964 Nobel Prize acceptance speech. During the speech, Dr. King shared his work, passion, and for empowering communities. Dr. King said, "I have the audacity to believe that peoples everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education, and culture for their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits." Today you will hear from experts that will share in a conversation that will inspire, educate, and empower us as faculty, staff, students, and community members. At this time, I would like to ask if you could warmly welcome our provost, Dr. Fortis Soteropoulos, to provide our welcome.
Thank you, Sheila, and thank you all for joining us here this afternoon. It is a great pleasure and an honor to welcome you all to this keynote event for VCU's week honoring the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King's enduring vision for all human beings is at the core of who we are as an institution here at VCU. It's especially important for us, being an institution that focuses on access, empowering human beings all human beings to reach their full potential, enabling student success and social mobility, producing new knowledge that lifts lives and saves lives, and disseminating this knowledge through our educational programs here. This is especially important for us, and we are tremendously thrilled and honored to be able to host this series of events this week. Dr. King's quote that we just heard from Sheila is one that has a meaning that transcends time and space. It's relevant not only for our local community, for the United States, but for the entire world, especially as this year, this past year in November, we all collectively hit a major milestone as the world's population crossed 8 billion people. So how we make sure that all these human beings become prosperous, and how we can ensure that justice for all prevails is really important. And of course, that makes Dr. King's vision so relevant and so timely, and as I said, transcending time. It is very appropriate, I think, and very befitting that we have this event here today at the ICA, our Institute for Contemporary Arts, which has been developed and designed to connect the arts and academics with the city of Richmond, with our community. This is VCU's strategic commitment to thriving communities and empowering economic development and financial success is at the core of this event, and it's at the core of who we are as an institution. But it is not just the buildings that connect our university with our community, and there is, we do a lot more as an institution, and for that it is a tremendous honor to introduce our president, VCU's president, Dr. Michael Rao, to offer some remarks. Dr. Rao.
Thank you, Fotis, and good afternoon, all of you. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. This is a wonderful kickoff keynote event, and I'm delighted to be a part of it. I want to thank Dominic for putting a lot of his own effort into this, and certainly for opening up this wonderful facility that is such an important icon here at VCU, of the #1 ranked school, public school of the arts in the country. I'm very pleased that the ICA is here. And I also want to say thank you to Shayla for her introduction. And I think this is a really important time, you know, especially now to get together so that we can continue to honor Dr. King. And frankly, knowing how important so many things were to him, we've got to find ways to continue to carry forward his legacy. His legacy is a really important one. I don't want you to spend too much time doing this, and I won't do this very much, but it is hard to imagine what would this world be like without the transformational leader of leaders, Martin Luther King Jr. I don't know, and I don't want to know. I think about the great things that this person did to influence not only all of the people of his time, but the people who have followed him. My dear father had an opportunity to meet Dr. King, and he adored him. He adored him not only because of his commitment to his approach to influencing and educating people, but also because he was so committed to doing what was just simply right for all human beings. He understood the value of human beings. And when I think about the many, many times that I've thought or listened to Dr. King in the few recordings that there are, few meaning that I wish there were more, this is a person who really just came to you from his heart. You could feel it. And that's how he reached the heart of so many millions of people and so many millions after, so many of us. And it's how he has arguably helped to shape the human rights that so many of us today enjoy and should never take for granted, given the fact that so many of our ancestors and people who came before us did not have the rights that we have today. And so we have to recognize that this was a movement, and that we must make certain that this movement continue. When we look around ourselves right here in Richmond, Virginia, we recognize that there are so many of our brothers and sisters, our fellow human beings, who we realize we have so much to do for them to help lift their lives on this journey. So let's use this week to continue to get ourselves organized. If you can't count on the things that Dr. King talked about at a university, I don't know where you can look for that honest focus on doing what we know is absolutely right. And that is the inclusion of all human beings. And so here we are, it's a Sunday, It's a weekend. It's a time that is often reserved for a lot of spiritual reflection and renewal for many of us. And it's a time to really discuss our bond with each other. And so I was thinking about in 1964, Dr. King's Nobel presentation, and he said something that I think is important to share with you. I could share a ton with you, and you will hear lots more in the course of today and in this week, but this is one I picked. So it's obvious that if man is to redeem his spiritual and moral lag, he must go all out to bridge the social and economic gulf between the haves and the have-nots of the world. Poverty is one of the most urgent items on the agenda of modern life, and here we are 60 years later, and it's still a very, very important thing for us to think about. So MLK Week 2023 is really focused with a theme on thriving communities that include all of us as human beings and the ability of all of our people to lead full lives. And as you will see in the course of the week, I'm guessing Dr. Nassim, who you and your team have put so much of this together, and thank you for that, that Quest 2028, our strategic plan, has pillars, and this is one of them. It's an important one. And so we are going to, at VCU, continue to build on partnerships and collaborations with the city and with the state and with counties and all other entities, private entities as well, to inspire the authentic gains in health, human health, and economic prosperity in our communities. And so I'm very excited about what this week will do to continue to advance our discussion and our ability to really organize and focus and get together and identify priorities that will lift the lives of so many others. Reggie, Thad, and my own colleague, Elsie, thank you for your willingness to take some time out of your Sunday to engage us in what will be a great discussion. Elsie, thank you for your willingness to facilitate this discussion. Reggie's obviously from the city, and Thad is from another institution, the University of Richmond. If we were only past that basketball game, this would have been easier. But in any case, assuming we win. But in any case, we will both win. We know that. I'm very grateful to you for your investment here at VCU, for the continued commitment to partnership, because this is how we get things together. Very few of us can get very much done alone. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And we're excited to hear some of your great wisdom.
To our distinguished panel, President Rao, Provost Soteropoulos, Shayla, Ryan, and thank you for everyone for being here today and joining us in this conversation. In October of last year, the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, which among other things works with universities like VCU to foster economic growth and build healthy, prosperous, equitable, and vibrant communities locally and globally, APLU as it's affectionately known, awarded VCU one of its highest distinctions for our university's effort in driving innovation and economic prosperity in Richmond and the broader metropolitan statistical region. Indeed, as you've probably heard before, VCU's estimated economic impact in the Commonwealth is more than $9 billion, with a little more than a third of that impact happening right here in Richmond. What my role has been under the leadership of President Rao is to assemble a team that can fully execute his vision to make certain that VCU's economic impact is equitably distributed in ways that ensures that everyone has access and the opportunity to learn, live, work, and optimize their well-being in the city and in this region. That school zones no longer determine a child's zone of proximal development and learning. That zip codes are no longer rooted in Black codes. And that places like the ICA never become a gate, but rather a gateway through which ideas can be shared, strategies can be implemented, and communities can thrive, thereby winning the war on poverty, winning the war for the middle class, and doing so without starting a war with those who have and have a lot more. Without question, the prosperity of VCU always will be inherently linked to the cultural and civic, economic and intellectual prosperity of Richmond and all of its constituents. Our VCU Community Engagement and Partnership team working with the City of Richmond, its institutions, and its people to make this happen are Dr. Magbuba Mosavo, our Associate Vice President for Community Partnerships, Stephen Davenport, Assistant Vice President for Social and Economic Development, and one of our core chairs for today's committee, Dr. Sherry Garmaz, previously an Executive VP at APLU, who was our Executive Director of Collective Urban and Regional Impact, Verinda Cobbs, Senior Manager for Civic Innovation and Partnerships, also a co-chair for today's committee, Rich Killingsworth, Executive Director of VCU Health Hub, and Dr. Faith Wilkerson, Interim Director at Marion Francis Youth Center. Could we please just take a moment to give them a warm round of applause for their work? With that, I'll yield the floor to Ryan Griffin, who will introduce our speakers. Ryan? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Dr. Nassim said, my name is Ryan Griffin, and I am in the VCU Business School studying marketing. As the topic name suggests, community wealth building can only happen through the efforts and collaborations of many people and organizations. We are fortunate today to bring together some leading voices from some of the biggest organizations in Richmond. These individuals I'm about to introduce are so accomplished, a full reading of their biographies would consume the entire hour that we have here for this evening. So instead, I would direct you to the formal event program to read about them and their impressive work. You can also use the QR code here for those who are a little bit more tech savvy. And meanwhile, it's a great pleasure to introduce Thad Williamson from the University of Richmond. We can give him a round of applause. Reggie Gordon from the City of Richmond. And Elsie Harper-Anderson, our moderator today from VCU. And she is from VCU's Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs. With that, I will turn the program over to you, Dr. Harper-Anderson.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. It's an honor to be here among these two justice giants, both of whom I have had the pleasure of working with through the Office of Community Wealth Building here in the City of Richmond. So I'm looking forward to an enlightened conversation. I've had many conversations with each of them before. So why don't I just jump right in? What have you learned through your career experience and journey that relates to economic justice? And what about thriving communities? Let's start with you, Reggie.
Thank you, Elsie. And thank you, VCU, for this opportunity and this conversation. Okay, so my career. It takes me back to 40 years ago when I was starting law school at Howard University School of Law. I remember the dean on that first day walked in and said to the room full of hopeful social engineers, he said, dismiss the notion of fairness. It doesn't exist in our society. And I think that was important to hear on the first day when we were trying to learn the law in order to be agents of change. So fast forward through all the jobs I've had and opportunities to engage with nonprofits and agencies and even local government. And I think there's a game that we play in this society, and those who have money create the rules, sort of change the rules, curate the environment, and that's a fact. And so as I've gotten to this point in my career, I'm trying to be a part of the hope for a new society or a new way that we can interact where everyone has access to money and economic upward mobility. I think that there are traps in our society, and a lot of us know how to navigate those traps, pitfalls, quicksand, and I think our role is to teach and direct others to navigate through those traps. Things like getting your education so that you can at least experience or have opportunity to experience a job that will pay you a living wage for you and your family. Things like do not have a felony on your record. Don't avoid having things like that happen in your background because the doors will close for good. You can't get housing, you can't get a job, etc. And also be able to, after you are educated, find a pathway to career or entrepreneurship that affords you the opportunity to raise your children free of government support. Because the people who turn to us looking for help have always are stumbling over those traps and those roadblocks and those barriers. So most of us spend most of our time trying to navigate barriers in our society. I'm like, is that why we exist? You know, and I hearken back to my dean, like, I want to be a part of the new America as opposed to just keeping people alive. I want them to thrive.
Great, thank you. Thad?
Thank you, and again, it's an honor to be here. And for the record, I am a VCU basketball fan, except for 2, occasionally 3 times a year. I'm not just saying that, like when the Rams beat Kansas to make the Final Four, I was out there on the streets on Broad Street with everybody else. And honestly, the president gave this terrible counterfactual to imagine the world without MLK. And I'll say this it's equally unimaginable to think about Richmond without VCU. You know, and this is the heartbeat and the anchor of the city. And I mean, you know that. I just want to make sure you know that I know that, and it's really an honor to be part of this. So, you know, as to this deep question, I wrote down some stuff. It's probably too much, but somehow at a fairly early age, yeah, I had an interest in social justice and racial justice. I was very inspired by the presidential campaign of Jesse Jackson in 1988, which is my senior year of high school. The first vote I ever cast was for him in the primary in North Carolina, where I grew up. And I was a volunteer at the Democratic Convention that year in Atlanta and got to see him come in as he came into town, you know, to give a speech in the park. And so the combination of seeing him in person with also seeing the poverty in Atlanta, I mean, it sort of put a fire in my heart and mind, like working on these issues is what I wanted to commit my life to. And so, you know, and I was one of these nerdy policy kids who was walking around with a 40-point platform in my pocket in case, you know, anyone cared, you know, and, but the fundamentals are things I still believe, which is everybody has a right to health care, it's a quality education, you know, to a decent job, to quality housing, and to live in a safe and decent community. So that was like my starting point, but the next stage was to develop the intellectual framework, you know, the historical framework, political science framework, to ask this question, why, if this is what so many people want, why don't we have this in the United States? Especially when we can look at other models of even capitalist systems that do a better job of providing those things for all its people. And obviously, there are numerous factors, but you can't go anywhere in that conversation without talking about race, you know, in a front and center way. And, you know, after college, I was privileged to work for a true giant, intellectual giant, and giant justice, someone who worked with the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, Gar Alperovitz, historian, and he's still alive and still going. But what I learned from him is really 2 things. One is, you know, the critique of liberalism and social democratic politics, not as a bad thing, but as unlikely to achieve its goals. And basically the system, for reasons Reggie articulated, persistently falls short in meeting the stated goals, especially around poverty and equity. But instead of that being a council of despair, it's a council to look elsewhere for where change may be possible. So what he advised was look at the level of local community. In particular, look at cities where it's actually possible to build political and governing coalitions around ideas of fairness. So over a period of years, was developing those ideas, but I always wanted to have the chance to see if we could do it in practice. And so by fortune, I got the job at U of R, 2005, came here to Richmond, and after spending a couple years just listening, learning, trying to see what's going on, frankly, a lot of time appalled at the level of structural inequality, obviously tied to racism in our city and region, but it's in realizing that there was room here for a conversation about doing something different and dramatically different. And I came to find that these sort of critiques of structural inequality that articulated as academic really rang true with much of the city, specifically Black Richmond, and including elected leaders, but also everyday people. And so, through the work with Mayor Jones, with Councilwoman Robertson, many VCU faculty, lots of people, Reggie was involved. We worked on the Anti-Poverty Commission, and that evolved into the Office of Community Wealth Building. And that language shift was critical for a couple of reasons. One is we're trying to send a message that we believe in the city and its people. The primary wealth we're talking about is actually people. So it's really a way to talk about human development, to make this shift. But also by putting wealth on the table to sort of say, this is not just about getting someone temporarily over an artificial numerical line derived by the federal government. This is more about power and dignity. And both those things are associated with wealth understood in its manifold forms, not just money per se, although money is obviously important. And so once you begin talking about wealth and putting that on the table, obviously you're going to have to talk about not just programs, but also ultimately about policy and structure. So that's what we've tried to do. I'll wind down quickly, but because I think we're going to talk more about community, but a key part of community wealth building is community and actually the interaction with real people. So I'll just leave it there so we can continue.
Thank you. One of the themes that seems to resonate with both of you, and because I've watched both of you as leaders, is hope. And I think that hope is very essential to getting people engaged, to getting policymakers on board, to getting the people's trust, and to get them to buy into the process. So I think that that theme of hope and that leadership style, leading with hope, is very critical for moving us forward, and both of you seem to focus on that. The next question is, what are some of the challenges that we have to tackle as a region as it relates to economic justice? Reggie?
Sure. And you've been a part of those committees and teams to try to help us think through pathways for hope too, so thank you for your work. Yeah. About right after Thad, I'm the second director of the Office of Community Wealth Building. Thad was the first, so I followed in Thad's footsteps. We actually engaged, we had some support from the Kresge Foundation to bring in an entity called the Institute for Alternative Futures, which is all about imagining what our communities could look like, local government, state government by 2035. So they built upon the framework that we had created with the Office of Community Wealth Building. And I will just describe to you the goal, because when we went through that process, what is the ultimate outcome? All this work, these committees, policy change, what do we hope to see? So I'll just list what Richmond could look like, our aspirational goal. It would be multi-generational strategies, as Thad has mentioned, universal access for healthcare, integrated behavioral health services, denser mixed income neighborhoods, high-tech self-care, integrated senior centers, integrated data using predictive analytics, enhanced income supports, immigration reform, human services workers as navigators and a personalized approach. So obviously there's a lot of work to do from today to get to that point, because as political winds change, we could go 2 steps forward and 5 steps back. So it's not linear. It takes a lot of work. But so the challenges are things like advocacy, the politics of the current day, making sure that we have agreement on getting children prepared to learn, 0 to 5. And why this can be complicated is because we all say we want that, but then it becomes something that impacts your own household. Where do your kids go to school? If you live in a neighborhood with an underperforming school, do you leave your kids in that school, or do you, because you're privileged, have them go someplace else? Needing denser neighborhoods, does that mean that you would support a multi-family dwelling to be built in your neighborhood, or would you object to that for reasons that I guess connect to your own personal property value? And also, Thad touched on it, this gets really sensitive about things like race and class, and those are uncomfortable things to admit about ourselves. And I mean, I'm not just saying it's necessarily white or black. It could be black middle class not wanting to have certain people in their neighborhoods as well. So it's a multi-layered, complicated reality. And I think we just need to face that as a hard challenge. And that's why conversations like this are so important, because we're all in it together, and all of us have biases, and let's just recognize that as we move forward to try to find solutions.
Thank you. And I would add that it's a complicated thing to try to tackle, but at the same time, Richmond has a very complex history, particularly when it comes to race. So adding that to as the foundation and then trying to solve all of these problems on top of it makes it something that will require great effort and intentionality.
Yep.
Thad?
Yeah, and I'll try to dovetail with what Reggie has laid out, but I'll start this way. In 2015, after the Office of Community Wealth Building had been going for about a year, we had a Community Wealth Building Summit, and Mayor Jones announced at that summit, a goal, citywide goal of trying to cut poverty 40% by the year 2030, which in numerical terms, that would have been going from about 25%, which is where it was, to about 15%, which is pretty close to the national average. And he and I talked about that in the office, and he said, absolutely, we have to be able to lay out big goals like that. And I think what he knew, and I knew, and others, was that to get that level of change, you will have to address some structural things down the line. Maybe not right away, because honestly, very few people are against someone who wants a job getting a job. So if we start at that level, great, let's do that. That's important work to be done if it's not being done, in an adequate way currently. So we kind of started with that because that was like something that wasn't terribly controversial. But as we get deeper into the goal, and if you don't know, the poverty rate has gone down to about 21%. So I think of it as we're about halfway into that time period, and we're about halfway to that goal. But the next bit is going to be more difficult because you are going to have to address housing, education, and segregation, and the nexus of those things, which, to be honest, for all our work, we haven't really touched in a serious way. So, and we could go on and on about this, within the school system. RPS still largely a segregated system. In 20-something elementary schools, the city's white children who are in those schools the majority of them are in just 3 of those, as a for instance. But really, that's a regional issue. We made this decision 50 years ago to have separate school systems, and there's even now not a political appetite to tackle that, you know, other than sort of around the edges, and reimagine what this metropolitan area would be like if Enrico, Chesterfield, and Richmond all had a common education system. You can't even say that, you know, in the political arena, but I'm not in the political arena right now, so I'm saying it so that, because we have to put ideas like that out there, you know, so that, you know, partly because I really do think that is the long-term solution, is to at least raise those ideas, but also, you know, to illustrate how far we are away from what we could be, you know, and housing is another one. Again, leaders with the Housing Authority and with the city have been talking about the redevelopment of public housing into something better for 30 years. And it's not true to say there's zero progress, but it's been limited progress relative to what has been not just promised, but what I think people sincerely want to see happen. And you have to ask yourself the question, why is that? And it's complex, but part of it is to do it the right way, which is the only way it's worth doing. To do it the right way is not an inexpensive proposition.
Right.
It's going to take hundreds of millions, probably $1 billion or more, to think about providing better quality housing as replacement housing for everybody who's in RHA public housing now, which is largely deteriorating and you know, unsafe and on various, you know, measures. Nobody is going to accept we just demolish that and send people where they will be. We have to have a community plan. To do it the right way is real money. Where's the commitment, not just from the city, because I think the city does more than a share on many things, but where's the commitment from the region and the state? So I still think we need to push that conversation and get it out there, because the city can't do all this by its own. And, you know, we could go on, but I'll just leave it for there.
Well, I want to comment on public housing. The first question about what have I learned? All right, when I first started with OCWB, you know, there's been a lot of work on getting community voice from residents of public housing. And during the process of talking to people who lived in public housing, I realized that I was putting my middle class mores on them to say, surely you want to get out of this neighborhood. And what we began to hear was, no, this is our home, you know. They were like, can you further explain what mixed income means? You know, this is like separate little towns. And we had to really make sure that we were being respectful of their sense of space and place, and not walking in to say, oh, your neighborhood is horrible. You know, we want to make something better for you. And when the response was, excuse me, you know, this is my neighborhood. I know you see on the news, but that's 1/10 of what really happens day to day with the network of people who are my support system, our support systems. So I think that's something we've learned together about having community voice at the table, as opposed to us outside of their presence, sort of charting out what would be better for them. And that was a real education, because they're towns. And we also heard there's some fear of leaving the safety of your town to go to another neighborhood filled with strangers who might be culturally different or might not appreciate your way of navigating life. So that was something that was eye-opening for me in this work.
And this reminds me of some research that I did in Oakland, California, long time ago during Hope 6, where we took a community where they did knock down a public housing community, and most of the people, there were 6 languages spoke throughout the public housing community, but the Hispanic community, most of those residents were relocated somewhere else. And the thing that wasn't planned for was all of the social services that they took part in were right there near their community. And the community had grown up around the needs of that population. So really talking to the people and understanding their life experience and what they need is critical in this regard. Yeah. The other thing that I wanted to bring up is that one of the things that we need to grapple with in Richmond is, one of the things I learned during my work with the Office of Community Wealth Building is the importance of alignment. Oh, yeah. We started out with Thad, and remember Thad, we had these buckets that we were going to tackle: housing, jobs, all of these things. But as we worked with the community, what we learned is that all of those things needed to be aligned. And the Office of Community Wealth Building engaged in wraparound services, because you can't separate housing from the need for a job, from some of the healthcare needs. It all needs to be aligned, and everybody needs to talk to each other and be on the same page. So that's another thing that I think we need to focus on, is getting those pieces more connected and aligned.
Can I comment on that?
Absolutely.
Alignment is key for the organizations that are trying to help, because nonprofits start up every single day. And I think when people do a drive-by through Richmond or any other, the county, and they say, oh, I see a homeless man on the street, we need to start a shelter, or I'm the one that can fix that particular issue. And what we are hoping people will begin to do is do the research first to find out what are the existing organizations that are already in that space. We have Help One RVA, Help the numeral 1 RVA, that list all the programs that we know about. And those groups need to come together to figure out what are the gaps or what are the impediments as to why we don't have predictable success with certain demographics, as opposed to we need more nonprofits and more agencies. We need to be have better alignment with the existing organizations. And that's what we've been hearing from the people who are in need. We were on a street corner once in Gilpin, and a guy said, we know how your system works. You all exist on 3-year grants from foundations. And once that grant vote goes away, then the program disappears. And we're left here trying to manage in your wake. So he's like, you also need to work out your financing differently, because you set these expectations with nonprofits and these programs, and then they're gone. So it looks like you really don't care about our neighborhood, even though there are tons of nonprofits helping us. So.
Good point. Dr. Martin Luther King shared in his speech a quote: "I have the audacity to believe that peoples everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture for their mind, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits." When you hear this quote, what stands out for you, Thad?
Well, obviously it's a powerful quote, and I think the first thing that leaps out is it's a caution against defining people by their deficits, especially low-income people. And what we found, and I've learned through the community process, is there are brilliant people living in every neighborhood. Even the courage and commitment and creativity of people living in Gilpin and Creighton needs to be recognized and celebrated and lifted up, and that's part of why we call it community wealth building, and not simply anti-poverty. And so getting away from the older mentality that you can just treat people like checkers on a board to be moved here and there. No, we're talking about respecting fellow citizens as subjects and listening to them, and as Reggie said, giving them a voice and being prepared for they may say something different than what you expected or what you planned for. But the other thing that strikes me about this is that I think King is saying here, people are full human beings, and we're spiritual creatures, we're creative thinkers, we feel things, and we also have to eat. And I think making sure those things aren't separated. So because 2 of these, the meals and the education culture, in theory, government can support those and can provide those, and policy can speak to those things. But dignity, equality, and freedom is about how we treat one another and how we regard one another, as fellow members of a community. And I think what King is saying here, among others, is don't tell me you respect me, and don't tell me I think you're equal without forgetting the fact I need to eat. So I'll leave it there.
I agree. Yeah, I think this quote represents our goal. This is the definition of a thriving community, and everything Dad says we need to take into consideration about how we get there together. I've often heard the same, we run the same circles, so people will say, how can I focus on learning in school when I'm hungry? So you can have all the programs in the world, but if there's no stability with there's food insecurity in that household, that'll be the challenge. And it goes on and on. Meeting those basic human needs and then building upon them.
Thank you. The one phrase that stands out to me is the audacity to believe. Things can only happen if we policymakers believe that it's possible.
Right.
If we continue the mindset that it's not possible, that's when we end up framing things from that perspective, and we end up making incremental and limited policy solutions. So for example, if we believe that it's possible for everyone to have 3 meals a day, if we don't believe that's possible, we don't give a lot of effort to innovative ideas and a lot of resources to innovative ideas like urban farming. We just brush those to the side. So I think the audacity to believe means that if we believe, then we think broader, we think bigger, we think more innovatively.
Can I just say on that, I think audacity, yes, but also at the time King was saying things like this, he was not dramatically out of line with where people thought policy was going. Society was getting more equal economically in the 50s and 60s, American society. And lots of people, John Kenneth Galbraith, other liberal economists, they really thought poverty would be over. They underestimated the racism. But King did not. In his last book, he names it. And he sort of says, Johnson's got this war on poverty, big goals. It's all technically doable. The resources are there. What's stopping us? And he thought that white America was not ready to take the next step, which is a tough diagnosis to hear, but darn if it doesn't ring true decades later.
When you bring that up, and that's an important point to keep in mind with the statistics cited earlier, that the poverty rate in Richmond has gone down. But when we look at it by race, what's the difference between that gain overall and that gain by race? So we have to keep that in mind when we're looking at our own poverty rate and any progress we're making here in Richmond.
When I first started the job at OCWB, I would make speeches, and I remember I tested out this sort of way to bring up this topic when I said, this is about audacity. I went, the thriving community that we want to envision, that means that when you drive through Richmond 2030, 2035, 2040, there will be no good neighborhoods and bad neighborhoods. There won't be any good schools and bad schools. Can you imagine a day where, that you can't, close your eyes or just describe to someone new to town or avoid that part of town because it's bad, whatever that translates into. To me, that's audacity, to believe that we can have a community where that no longer is our perceived reality.
Thank you. What recommendations or best practices can you offer to help us engage, intentionally support the theme of thriving communities, partnering for economic justice?
Like Thad mentioned, we now have ambassadors in the community, people from the community who give us consistent feedback about what's working, what they see in real time in their neighborhoods. And they made some recommendations already about how, maybe funding, because they are letting us know that they don't see outcomes either in certain aspects of philanthropic work or programmatic work in their communities. And they need to be at the table, and they are at the table now, and that's why we created the office, to have some consistent feedback loop with the people that we're partnering with to help them help the community. They are the experts on their communities. And I think we've been successful in that and gotten some national recognition. We won a Robert Wood Johnson Culture of Health Prize in 2017 because of the incorporation of community voice. So that's great.
Well, I was the director of the Community Well Building for 2 years as we started, and then came back to City Hall part-time working for Mayor Stoney, and who committed to put more resources in the office, which happened, which was really important. But since leaving city government in 2018, I've had time for reflection and also be part of national and international networks about community wealth building, which is a phrase that has been picked up by the Labour Party in UK and numerous cities and mayors, and it's also being used in other cities across the United States, in every region of the country. Somerville, Massachusetts, Rochester, New York, California, Cleveland, all are using versions of this language, and they all know about Richmond.
Right.
And so I think it's important for people in the room to understand that what we have tried to do does have resonance in the world. But my colleague and dear friend Melody Barnes at the University of Virginia, who was the leader of the Domestic Policy Council during President Obama's first term, she and I started collaborating. We eventually produced a book, which is called Community Wealth Building and the Reconstruction of American Democracy. And we tried to boil down this whole approach into like a paradigm. And so I think this is the best answer I could give to the question. And we're boiling down what makes OCWB type approaches, community wealth building type approaches, different than what is already going on. And I'll preface this, with a disclaimer that we're not saying it's dramatically different from other things going on, because people have poked around and strived towards these goals in different ways. But I think we're in a position to try to bring better alignment around sort of a common approach. And so the first thing is absolutely inclusive and meaningful participation on the front end. And that has been made concrete in numerous ways in Richmond. And Councilwoman Roberts and I spent many hours with the first version of the Citizens Advisory Board that not only reviewed, they actually changed in substantive ways, the plans that were developed and eventually got implemented by the city. And so actually the Maggie Walker Citizens Advisory Board was made official by City Council before the office was, because they saw that it was important too. So that and I think local government, is one of the best routes by which an ordinary person can meaningfully influence the world around them, because the input of average person on national policy for 99% of the population is limited to voting. Right. But here you can show up, you can speak in a city council meeting. It's not that hard to get on a commission if you're so motivated. There's many avenues for participation. Well, let's take that and formalize it and celebrate it and recognize it and say this is central to what we're doing, not just an annoying thing that we have to do. So I think that's front and center. But the second is these bold, audacious goals, because government does a lot of things already. So how do we know that it's going to add up to something different? So that's why, I think Mayor Jones wanted to put out that bold goal, was to say that this is not just more activities. This is, we need to actually change the reality of people's lives. That poverty measure by itself would be misleading, because we have to ask why and how it changed, and we have to say for who and get very precise and detailed, in the way Professor Harper-Anderson you mentioned. But without goals, it's just activity. We need change, and this is not just a wishful thing. This is what citizens elect people to do. This is the demand. We're not making this up. This is what people expect leadership to deliver, and yet for decades, it doesn't deliver. And when democracy doesn't deliver, we get into big trouble, as we've all found out. Okay, the third thing is thinking holistically about wealth. So it's financial wealth, but there's also human capital, there's social capital, There's the webs and the networks of neighborhood ties, that Reggie mentioned earlier. And institutions, VCU is part of community wealth. It's a big part. All of this is part of the holistic picture. And one way to think about community wealth building is like, what if all the assets, public and private and community held, were reshaped, realigned over time to meet the goal of the community? What would that look like? And so, needless to say, VCU has a big role to play in that, and has played, and I hope an even bigger role. UR has much more to do. All the institutions, there's a controversy around bon secours now, and they're being invited, so to speak, to do more, to be a community partner, to meet those goals, not just check the box, but really change things in terms of health equity. And I think that is part of the demands on our city in terms of alignment, not just internal city hall, although that's hard and it's difficult. I'm grateful Reggie's been there to try to corral that massive task, but the even bigger task of the alignment between the city of Richmond as a big institution, with VCU as a big institution, with all the other players in town around that goal. And so I think there's been progress, but there's more to do there. And then the last thing is ultimately inclusive economic strategies. So we can talk about alignment and all these other things, but at the end of the day, you have to change who's getting paid. Who's getting the job, who's prepared to get a job, who's getting a contract, who's prepared to get a contract. If we're not changing that, we're probably not changing anything ultimately. And again, that's the part where people may bristle when you start messing with or implying there's something to do with their bank account is going to be affected, because they're well-developed models and commitments everyone has. Everyone already has their own business plan. They're not looking to change it because you came along, right? but if we don't get to that point, if we don't figure out a way to redirect the flows of resources in a meaningful way, we won't get the change that the community is asking for. So those are 4 elements, inclusive, meaningful participation, bold equity, holistic approach, and then different economic strategies. And I think they can be put together different ways. There's no clear-cut path. There's no cookie-cutter path, and what we've done in Richmond will be different than Seattle or somewhere else. And that's absolutely fine.
I think it's appropriate to mention at this particular forum that Richmond is one of the cities participating in the Mayors for Guaranteed Income pilot. There are more than 30 cities now. It started with Mayor Tubbs out of Stockton, and Richmond had 18 families in the first cohort that received $500 a month for 2 years to test out this concept that we all know is true, is people just need more money. So if you have more money, isn't that the way people, is a stress reliever, but also allows folks to find the right pathway to get to the next level. We've had 18 families to go through the first cohort. That was December 2020 to December 22. We have 46 families that just started for the next 2 years, and we are learning. We can't discuss it much now because it's a pilot program and it will be analyzed by the University of Pennsylvania. However, I can say in this group that it's successful. People are getting the car fixed, going back to school, saving money, giving money to their relatives who are about to fall off the cliff. So because we've asked folks, do you know anyone in your family that has been financially successful? The answer is usually no. Do you know anyone in your family who can loan you $400? The answer is usually no. So here we have the ripple effect of having someone in a family with an extended relative even that can give you $20 or $50 or $100 to pay that light bill so your lights don't get cut off. That's what we're learning from this experiment. So imagine a day where maybe fewer programs, but more direct cash. That's a big policy shift that we're going to need advocacy once we move in that direction, but we'll have the research to back it up.
And I'm incredibly proud that Richmond has done that, and I had nothing to do with it, but so thank you and everyone involved for getting that up and going. But yeah, I think it does speak to, we've tried to link, the academic big picture frame with what's actually happening on the ground to actual people. And I remember when I was director and some of our caseworkers, they would describe just incredibly complicated situations just to get somebody to be able to accept a job.
All right.
How are you going to get your kids to 3 different schools at 3 different starting times and this, that, and the other with limited transportation?
Right.
Right. And so all these impossible situations. And there's another family that, you know, my wife and I became very close to that was basically experiencing homelessness over the same time period. And, you know, my conviction when I left was people just need money. And yet even at that time, it was like, we can't talk about that. That's too far. You know, and it's interesting that the political winds have shifted in a way that, you know, people, it makes sense. You know, if people have a little bit of lift, every other problem in life becomes just a little bit more manageable. And then it makes more likely that you can actually get the job and keep the job in a sustained way as opposed to falling back, you know, down the cliff. So, you know, I think the Richmond resilience thing is something absolutely needs to be built on, made permanent. I'm going way ahead of the evidence, I know, but I'm pretty confident what the results is going to be. But again, this speaks to why I set the big goal. Because in the big goal, you will find out the obstacles, and in addressing the obstacles and naming them, that will allow you to identify policies to overcome those obstacles.
Right.
And so I think this is all part of the iterative process to get where we need to go. Not just doing one thing, but doing more and more things over time.
Ironically, the pandemic pushed that forward because I think all Americans got to experience, okay, if I get a check in the mail during rough times, it will keep me stable as I can move forward. So we have people every single day who just need a little bit for a little while, and then they're on the trajectory for success. Yeah.
So we look forward to seeing the results of that, and we could go on and on and on with this conversation. Very rich conversation, very much needed, but I think it's time for us to turn to some questions from the audience. Do we have questions? If you all could write your questions down on cards. If you have written cards on the questions on the cards, I think there's somebody collecting them. Is there somebody collecting the cards? So one of the questions that we've received is, how do we deal with extreme income? Apple CEO reduced his own salary. When is enough enough? I think it says reduced. So how do we deal with extreme income? When is enough enough?
I'll take a shot at it, but I'll let, this is what I was saying in the very beginning. This is where it becomes self-reflective. I think in our country, if you're really smart or you figured out how to work a system, you're going to make those big bucks. And very rare is the person that will say, well, I'm going to reduce my salary so that I can share it with others. I mean, I guess that's at the core of the question. So I don't know if that's part of how we're wired in our society to say, I have enough, so I'm going to make sure that I'll take whatever I'm about to make as income and give it to other people. I mean, I guess that's what the challenge could be.
This isn't exactly on the question, but I think there's a role for economic development and how we go about economic development here. So the companies that we choose to bring, the deals that we choose to make should take some of the inequality into consideration and should take our vision for what we want our society to look like into consideration when we write those deals, when we think about how many jobs are going to be created, what kinds of jobs, what investment we're going to require from companies that we allow to locate here. So those economic development definitely has a role in how we redistribute wealth.
I agree, and I think the city has made some progress in terms of defining those parameters. So there's a document that came out last year called the Strategic Plan for Equitable Economic Development. And I'll be, this is, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I'm a part of a community group that pushes the city hall from time to time on things. And we were going to release our own report. And then we found out literally the same week that the city was about to release its report. And we looked at the city's report, and we had like 90% of what we would say. But basically, City Hall now has what for years it didn't have, which is some specifications about what kind of economic development things need to be in place before the city supports it, offers a subsidy, so we can actually use that, to generate some standards. But also, I think, we have to have broader models of success other than I'm going to be a trillionaire.
Right.
And we have to be able to communicate that to people, and to find, a dignified life is not requiring infinite money or infinite power.
Right.
And I think one of the original pieces that we were looking at were worker-owned firms or other ways to cut workers into the share of wealth from the start, which would make that scenario actually literally impossible. And that's a structural solution. But even basic things short of that, such as the right to organize, strong living wage, those kinds of commitments, absolutely the city can insist that of all our partners.
Thank you. Did we have any other questions? Thank you.
While she's reading them,
Trying to decipher.
we have, we need to get people ready for jobs that will get them to the next level of financial stability. With the, when I first started working years ago in nonprofits, we were trying to get people a job, that could be in the service industry. That no longer works. So people need, a single person needs to make, like $56,000 to be stable? So if you have a high school diploma, or maybe not, how are you going to go from what you're getting paid now to that wage? So we need to think differently about the avenue to get people trained to catapult over, the tiptoeing into something that might keep them alive, to get them to the point where they have a career that will keep them thriving, or even being an entrepreneur that will keep them thriving.
That's a good segue to this. It's more of a statement, but I'd like your reaction to it. To make an effective economic change in Richmond, we have to focus on educating students with true history and return skilled trades to schools.
Yeah, I agree with that. As one of the options, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. There's a conversation now about college and whether, I'm at VCU, but whether everyone needs to go to college.
Right.
And what do we do with those individuals who, for whatever reason, don't go to college? Are they just doomed to economic peril, or is that also our responsibility to make sure that they have the tools that they need to be able to make a living and support their families and all of those kinds of things? How can we move closer to rebuilding our schools toward the community schools model?
Well, Richmond schools are, they have the most important job other than some of the city agencies. The city agencies like DSS and OCWB and work with Richmond Public Schools, incredibly challenging, incredibly important. And that work needs to be honored and recognized. So I'm gonna say that first before saying anything remotely critical, because that's like the baseline reality. It's a tough job, and a much amazing work gets done. I think there's huge space still for greater alignment between the school system and the city, and the school system, the city, and the rest of the community. And the RV Education Compact, which I worked on a few years ago, was designed to try to have RPS and the city come together to have a shared joint plan for families and students, recognizing that a lot of the problems RPS teachers face have to deal with what kids are dealing with in their life in their homes, you know, outside of school. And that without attention to that in an orchestrated, coordinated way, the job inside the classroom was continue to be very difficult. And so that basic idea I still think is correct. And I think there is an education compact that mainly has consisted of meetings between city council and school board and mayor, and that's very good because it had not happened before, and it has helped some things go well, but I think there's room for even more in terms of these agencies are all working with the same families, literally. How can we devise the systems and you know, and then the protocols by which that work can be done together? And I know that work, that's a difficult ask, but I still think there's room to go farther there. It says, and to envision what if each Richmond public school was itself a hub for community services, you know, in which you walked in that door as a parent and you had access to everything that the city and the other nonprofit providers have to offer. I think that's within, well, I think it's something we can do.
Yeah.
We just have to name it and we have to fund it.
Yeah. Part of our plan with Human Services is decentralize the work. You know, we have libraries, community centers, schools, so you don't have to come downtown to get help. And technology as well. We need bright young minds to help us use technology for people to access the full complement of services that are available. You can do it from your home or at your local school. So I hope that's in the not too distant future.
So we're running short for time. I will just ask this last question. To quote Dr. King's last book, where do we go from here?
Wow. Well, you know, I feel that this is, we need to personalize this. You know, that's the people who showed up today, who are going to review this, those of us who talk about this all the time. This is not an abstract something that someone else needs to do. It starts with your own family. If you have family members who are struggling and can't seem to find their path, connect them to resources. It also starts with expanding your network. Thad touched on it earlier. I am absolutely positive that we're segregated in our networks. So if you don't know anyone that has figured out how to manage money in a certain way, or how to apply to college or stay in college once you get there, and then you're going to falter, you know. And if you, meanwhile, think that life should be as easy for you as it is for the other person across town, then we all need to meet each other to learn from our respective experiences and build these networks, because I dare say all of us who have some level of success can point to some door that was open, someone who made a call on your behalf, someone who taught you how to study, you know, or apply for a job, and that's how you kept moving forward. But if those networks aren't blended together, we're going to be sitting here again, you know, 5 years from now, having the same conversation, and we can't. We're ready. I think this is our moment, our moment to change in Richmond. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'll reference, I think Richmond has a spiritual challenge of we don't believe we can change. We don't believe we can do anything different. We believe things are what they are, and there's just massive amount of distrust. And so I think building community is absolutely essential to that work. And it's one of the consequences of segregation, but also it's a spiritual thing that allows you to stay in this work for a long time. So we think about King, but also think a lot now about Wyatt T. Walker. I've done work with Dr. Betty Crutcher to create a course based on his life and papers, you know, which are now at the university, and it's just incredible to learn someone who was one of King's compatriots what he did with the rest of his life. You know, both with his church and his engagement, you know, in New York City and New York State, you know, politics and economic development. And to have this a model of being able to have multiple strategies and multiple toolkits, being able to use power effectively when you have access to it, but then challenge it when you don't. You know, and a lot of times we box ourselves in that you don't have to be one, you have to be the other. No, you have to be able to do both. And we have to recognize that that's okay. And so I think, you know, recognizing it's going to take always a both-and approach, multiple paradigms. It's always going to take an element of pushing, but it's also going to take an element of cooperation. But we have to be open to it. We have to be open to change. We have to be open to constantly creating new relationships. We also have to be open to being corrected and to learning from time to time, because no one ever gets it right all the time. You know, and trying to, yeah, I think what this put the word on the table we haven't said yet. We have to reach towards love, because that's what was the underpinning of everything King did. So it sounds a little corny, but you know,
It's true.
It's true.
It's
So
love.
I'll stop there.
And thank you both for all of your comments and wisdom. And I think, you know, in the end, we all have to be just people-centered and community engaged.
Yeah.
And it's a reciprocal relationship of knowledge, information, and love. And so with that, I want to thank you all for coming. We look forward to seeing you in the reception. And thank you both, Reggie and Thad, for sharing this conversation with me.
Sure.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are about to wrap up shortly, but could you join me in thanking our speakers, our facilitator for this amazing conversation today? On behalf of Virginia Commonwealth University, I just want to thank you for attending this event that kicks off the celebration in honor of Martin Luther King Jr. We challenge you all to connect with VCU and with each other as we think about what thriving communities look like. On behalf of the MLK Committee, we also want to ask if our team could please stand so that we can recognize you if you assisted in planning and coordinating today's event. Any of the MLK committee, if you could please stand. Thank you so much for your hard work. The IES team, if you could please stand. If you are a part of the IES team or the community engagement team, please stand. Can we recognize them as well? Thank you so much for all that you've done. At this time, we want to ask for our students to come forward and thank our speakers. We have a small token of appreciation for each one of you for your service today for this amazing event. So they're going to present those to you, and I'm going to turn it over to my trusty colleague, Stephen Davenport, for some last remarks.
All right, thank you. I'll be very quick. I'm the last speaker before the reception, and I understand people want to eat. So what I do want to say, we want you to continue to engage in this important work. I don't want to miss the point that you all decided to show up on a Sunday, and you're here because you care about this work. When you look at yourselves and you look around the room, these are the people that are going to make the difference that we talk about today. So when we talk about where does Richmond look like in the future, it looks like whatever we want it to look like. It looks like the conversations that we have after this event. It looks like the feedback that you give us on how we can make these events more attractive and better. So thank you again for coming out. I encourage you to talk to someone else about your experience. And it's been an old quote, but there's a quote that says, not everybody can do everything, but everybody can do something. So thank you, thank you.
And as we're closing, we welcome you to join us in the foyer for our reception.
All right, we did it.